All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining the webinar. I'm just going to give it a couple of minutes for any other people who may still want to join us. All right. All right. While we're waiting for others to join us, I'm going to just start by introducing myself. So, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for spending part of your evening with me. My name is Dr. Rumbi Zaimudzonga. I go by Dr. Rumbi, and I'm a naturopathic physician here in Scottsdale, Arizona. So over the next 45 minutes, I want to talk about something that's completely changed the way that I think about chronic illness and cancer. So when most people hear the word mitochondria, they immediately think about energy, or they think of energy, which is perfectly accurate. But you'll find that that's only a very small part of it. There's so much more to mitochondria. And tonight, I want to show you why mitochondrial health affects so much more than fatigue. It's so important because it influences recovery. It also influences resilience, healing, even how your body decides where to spend its resources. So whether you've struggled with things like long COVID, chronic fatigue, chronic inflammation, illness, or cancer, my hope is that by the end of tonight, you'll understand your symptoms from an entirely different perspective. All right. So let's start with a story. I would like you, I would like to start by introducing you to a patient that I saw, I think at the beginning of the year, that really did help me or help influence how I look at chronic disease and cancer with regards to mitochondria. So I've changed the identifying details to protect his privacy, but the story itself is very real. So when he came to see me, he felt like he had lost a version of himself. So, based on what he was telling me, initially, before everything began, he was, busy lifestyle professional in the medical community. He worked out a lot, healthy, never really thought much about his health. He was active, he was busy, and he was able to handle normal stress without any issues, without even thinking about it. And then he got COVID, and this was about over a year ago. So obviously it lasted for about a couple of months and then he recovered, or so he thought. And then for a while it looked like everything had gone back to normal. But then after a few months, he started noticing that he wasn't recovering the same way he did before after a busy day. And activities that initially he thought were effortless started taking a little bit more effort. And suddenly, certain things required a little bit more planning. And small tasks started demanding far more energy than he had to utilize before. And what was mostly frustrating for him is he knew something wasn't quite right, but he didn't know quite how to describe it. And he started to wonder, which most people do, if maybe he was just out of shape or he was getting older, or possibly maybe he was just imagining it, right? He did routine tests, he went to see cardiologists and other specialists, and everything came back normal, which should have given him some reassurance, but actually led to a little bit more frustration, right? And at that point, when he came to see me, we didn't know yet what was causing his symptoms. But listening carefully to his story, it revealed a lot of important clues. So I'm going to share some of what he was experiencing at that time. All right. So as we talked, he started experiencing certain symptoms, which on the surface didn't really seem like they belonged together. For example, he would experience racing heart and at times palpitations at night as he was trying to fall asleep. And these palpitations started getting worse. And then as he started doing more, as his routine exercise became more difficult and he had trouble tolerating it. And he found that physical activities that used to make him stronger started leaving him feeling a little bit more exhausted. And then over time, he started developing GI symptoms such as heartburn, indigestion, as well as just discomfort in general. And what made his case especially interesting was all these symptoms, even though when he had COVID, it had lasted for a few weeks, these symptoms did not occur until almost 6 months after he had his initial COVID. So this made it very difficult for him to connect his symptoms with the COVID in the first place. So, of course, the symptoms happened, and then he underwent evaluation, full cardiac workout, which again did not help at all, other labs. And then, of course, he left it like that, and gradually symptoms subsided a little bit. And then a few months later, I think about 6 months after the initial COVID infection, he had another viral illness, another common cold. And soon after that cold, those symptoms that had started to dissipate came back again. And then again, started experiencing severe palpitations, GI symptoms, and everything else that we kind of touched on earlier. So literally, the pattern repeated itself. And it seemed as though his body was just struggling to recover. So by the time he came to my office, he wasn't just looking for symptom relief. In fact, his biggest fear was, is this going to keep happening every time I catch a cold? And he wanted to understand why this kept happening. As I listened to his story, one pattern stood out immediately. And that pattern helped to explain something many people with chronic illnesses experience. So now I want to pause for a little bit because at this point, I'm sure many of you may begin to recognize yourselves in his story because his story is not unique. In fact, I see this many times over and over in practice. Many people recover from an infection, surgery, maybe even chemotherapy, or a period of intense stress or a major health event. And then soon after that, it seems like the crisis has passed, life returns to normal, but for some people, it actually doesn't. Instead, they notice that they never quite bounce back. Recovery seems to take longer, right? A busy day requires 2 days rest, whereas in before it only required a day, possibly. And the most frustrating thing about this part is labs, imaging, visiting various physicians doesn't always provide the answer that you're looking for. And this disconnect can leave a lot of people questioning and wondering if they're imagining all these symptoms. So, if you've ever found yourself thinking, I know something's changed, but I can't quite explain it, then this webinar is for you. Because what we're going to discuss tonight may help to explain why your body feels different, even when conventional testing says or doesn't always provide the answers that we're looking for. So before we explain what's happening from a biological standpoint, I'd like to share 5 observations that I've found to be true with many patients that struggle with mitochondrial dysfunction. So, one of these first truths that I really want to touch on is the fact that you'll find that your body will always prioritize survival before it can fully invest in healing. And the reason it does this is you'll find that it's not that your body's working against you, it's actually doing what it was designed to do. Think about what happens when your body encounters a significant challenge, right? Be it a viral infection, chronic inflammation, autoimmune condition, maybe even cancer, or a prolonged emotional stressful event. Each of these can create a tremendous demand on the body. And what will end up happening is your body starts directing resources towards that. So, for example, and this is just a general example, and we're gonna, dive more into it. It could be that you've experienced an injury or an infection. The body would then focus on making sure you recover from that injury before all else, right? So that's what we mean when we talk about the body prioritizing survival over anything else. And then what you'll find in such instances is many people feel as though they're doing everything right, but they still won't feel themselves. And it's not because the body has necessarily stopped trying to heal, but it's because it's directing most of its capacity towards survival. We'll talk more about that in the coming slides. The next truth that I want to share is symptoms you'll find start long after the underlying problems begin. One of the biggest misconceptions in medicine is that if something caused your symptoms, those symptoms should appear immediately. I wish that was the case, but more times than not, unfortunately, it's not. It can be true in certain situations, but that's not always the case. The reason being that the human body is so resilient. So when something places stress on the body will do everything that it can to start fixing that, and it does that through adaptation. So, as it's adapting to whatever is going on, you'll find that it'll start recruiting other systems and it changes its priorities in order to fix that particular problem. But the problem in that is adaptation comes at a cost. And we'll talk more about that in the next slides. But what I really want to emphasize here is whether it's weeks, months, or years, the body may be working so much harder than we realize behind the scenes just to maintain what appears to be normal function. And then the third truth that I want to highlight here is that the body can appear to be functioning normally while quietly struggling beneath the surface. And this is one of the reasons so many people become frustrated. They don't feel well, but they're reportedly told that, for example, labs look normal or there's no obvious explanation to be found. I always remind my patients that normal labs are reassuring because they tell us that in a lot of times that there's no serious disease that's maybe occurring, and that is really important. But we never want to dismiss that. However, at the same time, the thing to understand with labs, and we'll dive more into this, is they may not necessarily register certain symptoms or certain changes that have started to occur in the body. And with this, I like to use an example with cars, for example. No, I'm not a car expert, but bear with me. So, for example, you'll find that with your car, when it starts breaking down, that doesn't always happen at the start. You'll find that more times than not, you're still able to start your car, you're still able to go where you need to go. But what might happen is you might start noticing maybe a check light comes on, right? A check engine light comes on. Or maybe it starts, feeling the drive is not as smooth as it used to be. And that's when you start to realize, something may be wrong with my car. So what's true with cars is actually true with the human body, that we don't automatically stop by shutting down. It's always the small things that build up. So then the next question becomes, what allows us to keep functioning for so long in the first place? And of course, the answer lies in the body's remarkable ability to adapt. Truth number 4 is that adaptation, as I've mentioned, is incredibly helpful, but mostly this is short term. But as this prolongs, you'll find that that short-term, very useful help can eventually become part of the problem. And one of the most remarkable things about the human body, like we said, is its ability to adapt. Every single day, your body's making adjustments to help you survive. It adapts to infections, injuries, emotional stress, inflammation, poor sleep, cancer, nutritional deficiencies, and countless other challenges. Without that ability, many of us simply wouldn't survive difficult circumstances. So the problem isn't adaptation itself. The problem occurs when the body remains in that adaptive state long after the original challenge has passed. And when that happens, you'll find that problems start to occur because the body's not able to return to baseline. We'll talk more about that as we keep going. And then truth number 5. The fifth and final truth is that the very mechanism that your body uses to protect you can sometimes become the very thing that makes recovery more difficult. At first, I know that may sound contradictory, but it's actually a normal part of human biology. When your body encounters a difficult challenge, it actively promotes protective responses. For example, inflammation, which we talked about in the previous webinar, is actually a good thing because it's there to signal and tell you, hey, something's wrong. Let us go fix that, right? The problem then happens when this is prolonged, right? Because as it becomes prolonged, it starts causing certain changes in the body. For example, you'd typically be okay with certain changes in metabolism because they allow the energy to be redirected towards the most urgent needs, right? And even pain, for example, can actually serve as a very protective signal to prevent further injury. And I think this pain example is actually a very good example because we'll use it, for example, when you twist your ankle, right? It can be a very painful thing. And then a lot of the time, you start walking a certain way, right? As we say, you're walking funny, and like, well, it's because I twisted my ankle. The reason you're going to walk funny is the body's is telling you that you're in pain so that you stop walking in a way that actually causes more strain to those ligaments, right? So what's true with ankle sprains is true with back pain and everything else in your life, where pain, for example, is initially a very good signal that helps you to stop you from causing more damage. But the problem, again, like I said, is when certain symptoms become become prolonged. Pain, for example, if pain signals are constant, that can lead to more stress, that can lead to fight or flight activation, which can cause a lot more problems downstream. That's why, while we appreciate the benefit of having pain, you never want to have pain that's ongoing, right? Same thing with inflammation, like we spoke about last time. And I will tell you the same thing applies to any disease, any concepts like cancer, for example, because you'll find that many of the physiological changes we see during cancer and its treatments are very adaptive, right? The immune response, the immune is responding to, for example, your immune system is attacking the cells that are, causing damage, your tissue is repairing, metabolism is changing. All these things are very necessary to get you to that point of recovery. The problem with that, though, is again, those responses become prolonged, right? And that's where you see, for example, patients will continue to experience fatigue, reduced stamina, cognitive changes, etc. So, because of this, my goal, especially when I have a patient right in front of me, is never to fight the body. My goal is always to understand what the body has been trying to accomplish, to identify what's preventing it from returning to its healthier baseline, and to support the systems that allow it to recover. Because as we understand these and we understand the purposes behind these responsive systems, we can begin to work with the body instead of against it. All right. So now that we've established these five truths, let's take a closer look at the mitochondria in general and what all the fuss is about. All right. But before I go any further, I want to take a moment to tell you why I created this webinar. This webinar is for someone who's noticed that now recovery is taking longer than it used to, or that they no longer bounce back after an illness, a stressful period, or a busy week like they used to before. If that's you, then you're in the right place. Or if you've been living with symptoms that don't quite fit neatly into one diagnosis, or you found yourself wondering why you still don't feel like yourself despite doing everything you can, then I hope this discussion gives you a new way of thinking, right, about what's happening. If you've been diagnosed with cancer, this webinar is also for you. Whether you're newly diagnosed, actively undergoing treatment, or you've completed treatment and expected to feel better by now. Many concepts that we're going to be discussing during this webinar, I hope will help bring clarity and help you understand what's going on with your body and understand why your body is responding the way it is. So my goal tonight is not to convince you that mitochondria are responsible for every single symptom or every disease. My goal is to help you understand one important piece of the puzzle. When we understand how the body allocates its resources and responds to physiological stress, many symptoms that once seemed unrelated begin to make so much more sense. So, if this sounds like your story, then I think you're going to find the rest of tonight's discussion very helpful. So, my hope isn't that you leave tonight with all the answers. My hope is that you leave asking better questions about your health. But that being said, if I'm able to answer some of your questions, then I'm glad for it. All right. So before we move into all the fancy science that I love talking about, I want to take a minute to summarize what I've learned so far because these ideas build on one another. So first and foremost, it's important to understand that healing isn't always linear. It is not a straight line. Most of us expect that recovery will happen in a predictable way. You get sick, you take something, you feel better within the next few days. And yeah, that can happen in most typical situations, especially if we're talking about acute illnesses, right? And that's awesome. But unfortunately, when we talk about chronic conditions like autoimmune conditions, for example, or cancer, that's not always the case. In fact, in reality, most recovery often includes progress, then some setbacks, and periods where it feels like nothing is working or nothing is helping at all. So all of that can happen. And because of that, I feel like it's important to really emphasize that, not necessarily to brace people for the worst case scenario, but to help people to understand what's happening with the valleys and the peaks and the valleys during your journey to healing, right? And another important thing to understand with that as well is symptoms don't always appear immediately, as we talked about. Like we discussed with that patient that we've been talking about. The body can compensate for weeks, months, or even years before symptoms begin to show. And then the third thing that I'll highlight here is that recovery doesn't always happen completely on its own. I really wish it did. Sometimes the body returns to its previous level of function, but sometimes the body actually needs additional support. And that support can be whether it's IVs, whether it's supplements, or different forms of treatment. Sometimes the body just needs a little bit of help so that it can get back to balancing the demands that are placed on it, as well as maintaining resources that it needs for other things. So now let's talk about what happens when we take a closer look by taking a closer look to the systems that are involved. All right. First and foremost, because we've talked about how, the body can respond to things like stress and illness, I want to take this a step further and talk about, for example, in this case, how the body decides to, or where the body decides to spend its resources. So you'll find that one of the concepts that I like to use every day, especially when I'm explaining things to my patients in clinic, is that the body has to make a decision each and every day. What do I mean by this? Every minute of every day, your body's performing thousands of jobs or tasks simultaneously. It's repairing damaged tissue, it's regulating your immune system, it's producing hormones, supporting digestion, maintaining brain function, which can be a little bit more for those of us who like to overthink, and then as well as doing other things like healing from injuries and protecting us from infections and toxins. And all of these things require energy and nutrients. When you're healthy, this is a no-brainer. The body has enough capacity to do all of those jobs. And you don't even think about it, right? But when you have something that's affected you, whether it's an illness, emotional, something emotional, maybe grief, whatever it can be, that can actually deplete your capacity. And when that happens, or when the situation changes that demand on your body, what you'll find is then the body has to start prioritizing its resources and sending them where they're needed the most. This doesn't mean that it stops repairing or it stops healing. What it simply means is that some processes will receive more attention than others because the body is trying to keep you alive while managing whatever challenge it's facing. I think this is one of the most helpful ways to help us understand why recovery can feel so different from person to person. It's not simply about diagnosis. It's also about how much capacity the body has available and how much of that capacity is already being used. Once we understand that the body has to allocate its resources, the next question becomes, what happens when more and more of those resources are devoted to survival? And that's what we're going to explore next. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, when most people think about mitochondria, two words come to mind: powerhouse, or as we talk about energy production, right? But there's so much more to it. And I want to bring to the surface two words that are often not put together: resilience and protection. When we're healthy, our bodies are able to do both quite easily. They can protect us from immediate threats while also maintaining the resilience that we need to recover, adapt, and continue functioning well. The challenge, though, however, comes when the body is exposed to significant or prolonged stressor. Suddenly, protection becomes a priority. The immune system becomes more active, the repair process increases, hormonal signaling changes, repair and metabolism will start to shift to meet the body's most immediate needs. All of those responses are appropriate because they're designed to help us survive. But the difficulty is that the body has to stay in that protective state for a prolonged period of time in some instances. And then that means that it'll have fewer resources to help maintain resilience. When that happens, now recovery slows down. And as we mentioned, like with this patient, we find that exercise becomes harder. Sleep no longer feels restorative. And that's when patients will often tell me, I don't feel sick every day, but I just don't quite feel like myself anymore. And we see this a lot, like I said, with chronic illness, right? And especially in cancer. Because what will happen in those instances is whether it's illness, chemotherapy, radiation, or any form of treatment, even immunotherapy, these place such a large demand on the body that it completely changes how your mitochondria functions, as now the body has to focus on you surviving that instance. And when it does that, now because we're taking away from resilience, that's when people start experiencing things like brain fog, pure exhaustion, fatigue that never goes away. So basically, what the body's trying to do is it ends up sacrificing normal function for survival. So to understand why this happens, we need to take a closer look at the organelle that's responsible for producing much of our energy, the mitochondria. So, with the mitochondria, as I mentioned, when people think mitochondria, they typically think energy or powerhouse, and that's absolutely true. They produce ATP, which is primarily the most important source of energy that our bodies or our cells produce to perform work. But that is such an incomplete definition. If all that mitochondria did was to make energy, we would not be having this conversation tonight. The reason mitochondria is so important is because virtually every system in the body depends on them, be it your brain, muscles, immune system, as well as your heart, right? Even the process of repairing damaged tissue depends on mitochondria. So, in other words, mitochondria don't just provide energy, they influence how well your energy utilizes the resources, right? And you'll find that mitochondria is available in every single cell in your body except for one cell, the red blood cell, which I'm totally geeking out about. And I would love to tell you more about why that is, but that's not important right now. What's important to know is it's the only cell in the body that actually does not have mitochondria. And you know what? I'll tell you because I'm itching to say it. So the reason why red blood cells do not contain mitochondria is their main function is just to transport blood. So because of that, it wants to maximize the space. But now let's get back to what we're actually talking about, which is not really red blood cells in this talk. It's mitochondria. So as I've mentioned, mitochondria are found everywhere. And in our bodies, we have trillions of that mitochondria. And that is why people that have mitochondrial dysfunction don't simply complain of fatigue. They will experience systemic issues because mitochondria are found in all systems in your body. And when there's an energy deficit in any of those systems, You'll find a manifestation of various symptoms such as slow recovery, digestive symptoms, muscle weakness, all of those things, because they're all affected. All right. And that brings us to what I believe is one of the most important concepts in today's webinar. And that is healthy mitochondria help determine how much capacity the body has available to perform all of its essential jobs, right? So think about everything that your body's trying to do at any given moment, right? Like right now, as you're sitting listening to this webinar, your immune system is constantly monitoring for threats. Your digestive system is absorbing nutrients. Your liver is processing toxins and medications. Your brain is coordinating millions of signals every second. Your muscles are repairing themselves, right? Your tissue are constantly replacing damaged cells. That's all happening literally in milliseconds while you sit here. And when your mitochondria is functioning properly, your body is better equipped to meet with those demands. But when mitochondrial function is impaired, the body still has to function, it still has to perform all these jobs, but now with fewer resources. And that's why I like to think about it as an energy budget, right? Because we all have a budget, right? Whatever amount that is that you'll tell yourself at the beginning of the month, this is good, this goes to that, this goes to that. And as the month progresses, or as those that budget starts to get tighter, you will start allocating specific things and letting go of things that you know are not necessarily important so you can preserve the most important things. Your body's the same way. It doesn't stop working. Instead, it starts making trade-offs, right? So some processes will continue because they're essential for survival, while others will become less efficient, right? So we're talking, for example, detox pathways may slow down and get sacrificed so that your brain or your heart can still keep pumping, doing what it needs. Healing, for example, is another function that may get sacrificed in the process so that your body can still try to do as much as it can because it's now operating on a tighter margin. So then the question becomes, what determines how much capacity the body has? It turns out that the mitochondria are constantly responding to signals that it receives from the world around you that is within your body. All right. So as we mentioned, the body runs on an energy budget, right? So what I want you to imagine, because as I had already touched in, right, we said imagine it as a monthly budget, right? You've got money coming in, bills to be paid. If the income is greater than the expenses, that's so great, right? And then we have leftover, we can go on vacations, we can save. And if there's any unexpected events, well, it's easy for us to handle. So, in the same way with your body, whenever your mitochondria is healthy, it's able to reserve things for unexpected events. Now, imagine that it's not functioning optimally and an unexpected event happens. That's going to completely throw the body off because there's no reserves in the savings account, right? So now your body has to look at every single thing it's doing, from your heartbeat to healing to detoxing, to make sure that it keeps you alive. And that becomes the most important thing. So for someone with chronic illness, be it mast cell or cancer, what you'll find is the body will start prioritizing and it'll start, for example, in cancer, responding to the tumor. And that becomes the main focus, trying to maintain optimal organ function, adapting to treatments. And this requires such an enormous amount of energy. And another important factor about this is why two people can have the exact same diagnosis, but feel completely different. Because it's not about just about the diagnosis itself. It's also about the energy demand, right? It's about, for example, for someone, the body might decide to prioritize that and sacrifice that detox pathways, which in turn causes others underlying or downstream symptoms. Whereas in for someone else, based on their history and how the body looks, the mitochondria or the body will decide to sacrifice concentration. So now they have severe brain fog because the body's now allocating that energy to making sure you stay alive and you're able to tolerate treatment. So, put simply, the body's constantly balancing your budget. balancing income against expenses while trying to preserve the most important functions that are essential for survival. So then the next question becomes, what causes the budget to become tighter in the first place? What kind of demands are placed on the body that causes expenses to go up? So, before we dive into that, I want to, give a little illustration. So let's think about these three individuals, right? We've got an athlete, a chess master, and a weightlifter. So when we look at our athlete, he's all about endurance, right? The athlete. And the thing with that, when you look at it at first glance, when you look at the endurance one, he has to have a substantial amount of energy in order to endure, whether it's swimming, whether it's a triathlon, triathlon. Oh my goodness, I'm getting tongue-tied. Or whether it's just biking, whatever the case may be, they require an enormous amount of energy that's constantly available, right? And is able to sustain prolonged activity. So their body will adapt differently. And then you look at the weightlifter. While they may not necessarily have to have a lot of endurance, they need to be able to get a large amount of energy within a short amount of time. So then their mitochondria is going to be fashioned, to allow them to adapt in that way. And then let's think about the brain, for example. So the brain only it consists of what, about 2% of our body weight, but you'll find that it actually uses approximately 20% of our energy reserves. So in other words, even though when you look at it at first glance, you would never assume that the chess master uses anywhere to the same amount of energy that an athlete would use, you would actually be surprised because it takes a lot of energy to think. Right. So this same concept that we're using with this applies to the human body because every single organ in the body that has a different job has different energy requirements. Because your heart has to beat continuously, it's going to require a whole amount of energy, right? Your liver is constantly processing nutrients, hormones, toxins, medications. Kidneys are constantly filtering blood every minute of the day. So all of these systems all pull from the same finite pool of energy. So again, reiterating what we were saying, if that we have that finite pool, depending on how much energy is available, as they continue to pull resources, someone out there will end up, or in the terms of organs, will end up not getting exactly what they need. Right. And this is really important to understand, especially when we move into the next section, because I want to show how a simple way of thinking about how the body manages those competing demands every single day. Right. So let's take it one step further, right? So again, we've talked about income and expenses, but I want to look at things like infection and inflammation, for example. When you have an infection, your immune system gets activated, and the immune system requires ongoing energy supply in order to fight that infection. Just in the same way, if we're looking at cancer, because of the metabolic changes that are happening, a tremendous amount of energy is required in order to be able to sustain, whether it be surgery, chemotherapy, or immune therapy, right? And then, of course, when you have poor sleep, that again reduces the opportunity for for restoration. Caregivers, for example, which a lot of people never think about this, require a lot of physical effort and a lot of mental, emotional things going on, right? A lot of interrupted sleep. Another example is grief, which actually changes how your nervous system, endocrine system, and immune system function. Chronic stress, for example, keeps the body in a heightened sense of alert, which requires a lot of resources and pulls away from resources that would otherwise help your body to rest and restore. Right? And it's important to understand when we're talking about this, that all these things that we're talking about all require energy. And the body doesn't have just one energy account, does not have an energy account for each thing. You know how, like, for example, when we're budgeting, you'll have a budget for whether it's the mortgage, you have a budget for food. In the case of the body, there's no little, mini budgets that are set aside. Again, it's all spending from the same budget. And I've said this before, and I keep zoning on this because it's so important to understand. Because when you can understand that, it really does help you to understand why you may start experiencing certain symptoms. All right. So from there, like we said, as you're experiencing, whether it be grief, emotional stress, chronic disease, As you continue to experience that, you'll find that that energy reserve that you had, that capacity that you had, keeps getting pulled on. And as that energy continues to get depleted, that's when one starts experiencing, for example, more brain fatigue, oh, sorry, more fatigue, more brain fog, etc. Right? It becomes like each and every day becomes harder and harder as you go on. And because these resources are being depleted, you'll find that recovery, repair, resilience, all those things become delayed. It takes longer now to feel better. And something that I always tell my patients, and this rings true, is in some cases, if you've experienced an illness for 10 years, it might almost take 5 years or even 10 years to get back to where you used to be, depending on the amount of damage that has been done. That's not saying that you completely or you never recover. It's saying the body will need time to get back to where it was, right? And this is such an important concept to grasp, right? And this is especially important because you'll find that if you have an ongoing onslaught of things happening, the body will typically postpone recovery, right? And as the body's postponing recovery, it ends up being stuck in a cycle. And that cycle is very difficult to escape if you do not address what's causing those demands to be placed on the body. So in other words, end up getting stuck in a loop. And this is a cycle that I believe most people with chronic illness and even many patients living with cancer find themselves trapped in. It often starts with a significant stressor, right? That stressor could be an infection, could be the cancer diagnosis itself, whatever that may be. The body will respond exactly like it's supposed to. It adapts. And then after that, the body shifts its resources, right? Increases whether it's immunity, metabolism, whatever it has to do to prioritize survival, right? Which is healthy. But the problem is, as it stays there, that reserve starts to shrink. And as that reserve starts to shrink, recovery doesn't fully occur. And when that recovery doesn't fully occur, guess what happens? If the next stress comes in, it hits harder than the previous stressor. And then now imagine that another challenge comes on and another challenge. Now, what you're experiencing is a roller coaster where, as much as the body still is trying to recover, it's very hard for it because now it's become so depleted and it no longer has reserves to take care of a possible next challenge. So thinking back to our COVID patient, as patient we started talking about, what actually happened to him is after the first illness that he had, he never fully recovered or returned to his previous level of resilience. So when that other viral illness came along, what you find is those same symptoms returned and were even slightly worse because of that. And again, like I said, this is the same thing we see in a lot of chronic illness, right? And this loop can happen for months, weeks, even years, right? So what does this actually look like in everyday life? In everyday life, what you'll find is everyday things start to cost more. As I mentioned before, where before, if you were able to survive on 3 hours sleep, now you can't. Now you can't even for some people, every day becomes harder and harder to get out of bed, right? For some people, exercise becomes a non-option. They can't even do that. Everything becomes so hard because of what they're experiencing, because of that shrinked budget. And as I mentioned, a lot of the time, people don't just suddenly wake up one morning and realize that they have mitochondrial dysfunction. These symptoms are subtle. For some people, might be like, man, I don't know it's so weird. It's like I'm struggling to remember things. I used to be so good at remembering stuff, right? I'm forgetting people's birthdays, right? These are the subtle things. Or, this is so interesting. Typically, when I would get a cold, I'd be fine within 3 to 4 days, but now it seems to be taking longer. That being said, I do not again want you to stop worrying and thinking if that's happening to you, then you have mitochondrial dysfunction. What I'm saying is that's typically how things happen. But that being said, it's so important to understand your body, right? So you can understand what's going on. All right. So going back to our patient that we met at the beginning, like we said, you'll find that at first his story didn't make sense, right? We're looking at all these symptoms that seem disjointed. But now, having explained and having gone through this webinar as we have so far, I'm sure now you can start to put the pieces together and start to understand that what literally happened with him wasn't that the cold caused everything happened. It's just that when that happened, while the body was able to recover or recover from that cold, it never really fully got back to how resilient he was before the second onslaught happened. So it wasn't that the virus kept making him sick, it's just that his body could not get back to baseline. And what I found, especially as I started looking at his case and started looking more at that, we started digging deeper so we could figure out what exactly was causing all of his symptoms, what was preventing him from getting back to baseline. As I've mentioned before, adaptation is so important because it keeps us alive. But with that being said, you'll find that, especially with this patient's case, that adaptation stayed for longer than it was supposed to. His immune system stayed engaged for longer than it was supposed to. And when that happened, that actually created more fatigue in his case. It actually caused strain, for example, with his cardiovascular system, because now his heart had to work harder. And more importantly, in his case, it started affecting his autonomic nervous system. And when it affected his autonomic nervous system, it started causing other challenges and it made it harder for him to respond to stress, right? And as I mentioned, the problems began when his response systems never turned off. And I really want to emphasize this again in saying the problem was not the virus itself, even though it was the root cause. The problem is what ended up driving his symptoms, which was not the virus itself, but how the body maintained that response longer than it should have. All right. So with that, we find that in this case, because it stayed longer than it should, a shift happened in his body, and that shift made all the difference with how his body how his body coped moving forward. So, looking at this patient in particular, first thing I looked at was, okay, we see the symptoms are there, but it wasn't about what symptoms am I supposed to treat. The most important question that I asked myself when I was facing him was, why isn't his body recovering? Right? And as the pieces started coming together, I started looking at how the different systems came together, how his systems were interacting. And that's where we found that because his body never recovered in his case, and we find this with a lot of patients, it created so much stress that it led to glutathione depletion. And for those who are not familiar with glutathione, glutathione is our master antioxidant that helps us to take, when you have free radicals, any toxins, glutathione is like the big dog that helps to take care of that. So in this patient's scenario, what happened with him is he had a significant glutathione depletion that had been triggered by the virus itself. And when that depletion happened, it started affecting his mitochondria. So now his body was still trying to produce the same energy, but his resources became depleted. And when those resources became depleted, ultimately they started affecting his autonomic nervous system, which is that fight or flight. And when that autonomic nervous system was affected, because autonomic nervous system is connected to our GI system, it's connected to our breathing, it's connected to our heart rate, it started causing all his other systems downstream. It affected his GI and caused all those symptoms that we initially started talking about. It started causing him to have palpitations. And what was interesting in his case is he was experiencing exercise intolerance, which did not happen soon after exercise. It literally happened when he was about to sleep because while you exercise, and exercise is a great thing, right? Because it creates a strain on your body, which is temporary to teach your body resilience. In his case, what would happen is he would exercise, but his body would not switch off. Instead, it would stay on all the way to nighttime. And when he was trying to sleep, what ended up happening is his body did not know how to relax. It did not know how to calm down. And that resulted in him having palpitations. So once we started, when I realized that was what was going on, the first point of call was to restore his mitochondria, to restore his glutathione and everything else. Because once we worked on what was causing that depletion, everything else fell into place. So that being said, as we're talking about him, I do want to emphasize that because I see this a lot, that one of the biggest misconceptions when it comes to mitochondrial dysfunction is simply about fatigue. And as we've talked about, you've stayed with me for almost 50 minutes now, and I think we've beat that horse. It's dead, it's now resurrected. But my point being that it's so much more than that, right? It's understanding all the symptoms that are connecting it. And in this case, like I said, some of the symptoms that he was experiencing, we talked about how they came to be. Brain fog, for example, was one of his symptoms. And the reason why he was experiencing that is, again, the resources had been reallocated to other parts of his body. All right. And as I had mentioned before, with him, he had done all the labs and everything else, and they had come back normal. And that had been one of his biggest frustrations. And we touched on it earlier, but what I want to highlight here, as promised, is when we look at labs, normal labs do not always mean that there's normal function because there's what we call the gray area. And this area is that point in time that's between when you first start experiencing symptoms and your body's trying to adapt to when it actually manifests into a disease. It's the part where your body is trying to, what we call homeostasis, where it's trying to restore normal function. And in doing that, your body's pulling from resources to maintain normal function. So at that point, you will find that typically labs don't always show what's going on. And that's exactly what was happening with him. So the goal, especially when we're talking about this patient's story, what's so important is I don't want you to leave you with, oh, labs are not great or, oh my goodness, am I dying? Not at all. My goal is to help you understand that when you're experiencing persistent symptoms, even when labs are saying everything is okay, you are not crazy because you know your body best. And at times, just because certain things are not showing us what you would think they would show, it doesn't take away from what you're feeling. And it's so important to listen to your body and understand certain things that are going on. And in this, like I said, my hope is with this, I help you to kind of start piecing certain of these things together to try to understand, or at least to start understanding that every single thing in your body is connected. And because it's connected, while you may experience something like fatigue, it could have been caused by something that you may not even consider at that moment in time, right? So, that being said, we've kind of been talking about, like in this case, the patient with long COVID. We've been talking about chronic illness, but I really want to touch a little bit on cancer because, again, a bulk of my practice is seeing cancer patients, but also this is so important because, yes, while cancer, a lot of cancer patients may experience this, this applies to anybody, to be honest, right? So, when it comes to cancer, it creates its own set of unique demands, right? Like I said, it changes your metabolism. It changes where your immune system is going. It changes how your body interacts because now it's focused on the tumor. It's changing how your body is constantly maintaining normal function because now it's experiencing extraordinary physiological challenges. And then on top of that, if we add treatment, which could be surgery, now we're throwing in tissue repair. Or if we're throwing chemotherapy, now we're throwing in toxicity and everything that comes with it. Or we're throwing radiation, now we're throwing in oxidative stress and so forth. None of these happen for free. Every one of these symptoms will require energy, and that requires the body to completely change how it functions, right? And as it's completely changing this is why you'll find that, especially in cancer, fatigue is such a common symptom because of what the body's having to do in that area, right? And understanding this does not replace conventional treatment, right? It complements it because if you can understand this, then you can understand why it's so important to have something else layered on top of even typically conventional treatment for those who decide to go that route because your body is having to do a lot and it's important to look at things like mitochondrial function and to help restore that, right? And then aside from that, still talking about that, as I mentioned, fatigue becomes so much more complex because of everything else that your body's having to do, right? And when you find that all these demands are drawing from that same energy reserve, then you start to understand, okay, this is no longer just a fatigue issue. This is a capacity issue. So now when you can understand that this is a capacity issue, your focus should then change from not only helping that person to recover, but also helping the helping the body to increase its capacity, to adapt, to be able to help the body to repair. And that all comes down to actually increasing the body's capacity. Because you'll find that if you can increase that body's capacity, that's going to help with healing, that's going to help with adaptation, that's going to help with repair, and that will also help to reduce unnecessary stresses. All right. So, next thing I want to touch on, and this is so important, is cycle. Remember how we talked about that loop, right? Good news is that cycle can be broken. Everything that we've discussed today, everything we've been building upon, how the body gradually reduces reserves over time, and how, all those difficulties, right? And the loops that happen. The other side of it is recovery is possible, right? It often results in many small improvements working together, and that's the path to recovery. You start looking at all the different pieces and you start that restoration process. And one of the first things that you want to do is actually reducing unnecessary demand. What do we mean by that? That's when we're talking about diet and nutrition, making sure you eat well, making sure you sleep well, focusing on mind-body medicine, which is such an important component of health. All those things, because they can increase demand, if we can focus on reducing that, that goes a long way towards restoring capacity. And then the other thing that we want to focus on while we're talking about increasing capacity is supporting the body's ability to increase energy. So that means focusing on supplements as well as IVs and other things, day-to-day activities, prayer, meditation. All those things become so pivotal when it comes to breaking the cycle. Another thing that you want to focus on is restoring flexibility. So remember how I talked about how one of the key things that we have is the body's ability to adapt. So that's what I mean when I talk about flexibility. We want to restore that flexibility so we can help teach the body to adapt. For example, we teach the body, the nervous system to adapt to stress so that the autonomic nervous system is not always switched on. We teach the immune system to adapt so that way it's not always triggered, which would actually cause eventually autoimmune conditions. And then the other most important thing when it comes to improving resilience, when it comes to breaking the cycle, is to improve resilience. So resilience doesn't mean you never get sick again, but it means that we actually start creating those reserves for the body so that next time there's a slight onslaught, it doesn't completely wipe you out. The body's able with its resources to take care of that while maintaining that balance that we talked about, maintaining that perfect system, maintaining that reserve that allows your mitochondria to function optimally, right? So again, this is just summarizing what we talked about, which when we support recovery, we're reducing demand by eating well, we're restoring flexibility, and we're improving resilience. So where's our patient today? Our patient is doing so much better. When I followed up with him just last week, I can tell you now mitochondria is much better. The testing has come back and his resilience has improved to the point where he's now able to exercise. And with regards to palpitations, he rarely has them now. And he actually had an episode where he had a cold recently. And it was so amazing because while it affected him, and I think he had mild palpitations for that night, that was all that happened. His reserves have improved so much that now he's starting to feel like himself again. So again, like I said, the cycle can be broken. And that's important. And that's something that I want to encourage all of you with. Right. So as we close tonight, I want to leave you all with one final thought, right? So throughout this webinar, we've talked about mitochondria, energy production, adaptation, recovery, resilience. But if there's one message that I hope stays with you, it's this. When the body's on an energy budget, right? Its decisions can change depending with what's happening. And when the body is limited capacity, it prioritizes survival, which can then affect recovery, repair, resilience. And that can lead to all those symptoms. But while that's true, the opposite is also true. When we reduce unnecessary demands or improve the body's capacity, those decisions help to improve healing, right? And again, what I was saying is, especially, and I want to drill this in because this is so important. Yes, it's important to understand symptoms, but it's also even more important to not spend time chasing symptoms, but to spend time asking why the body's experiencing what it's experiencing. Because the body's not your enemy. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do. It's adapting, it's protecting us, it's helping us survive, right? And our job is to create an environment, though, where it's not spending all its energy on survival, but we can help it to become more resilient. And that comes with uncovering what's going on and then taking the necessary steps to help the body do what it needs to do. All right. So, with that, I want to thank you so much for spending your evening with me. I know there's countless things you could have been doing, but so I truly appreciate that you chose to spend your time with me. And my hope is that with this, you walked away with a different way of thinking and a different understanding of how things go, especially when it comes to recovery and how the mitochondria works. I also encourage you not to feel like you have to remember everything we've covered because it's a lot of information, right? Most important thing is understand that our bodies are resilient. Our bodies are beautiful and they have this capacity that allows us to flourish. The key is understanding and listening to our body so we can help it to do what it needs to do. All right, so I know we don't have a lot of time, but I wanted to give the floor to any questions anyone may have at this point. And for those who have no questions or we're ready to go, again, I just want to say thank you so much for attending ahead of time. All right, so that being here, I'm going to leave it off to some Q&A questions. All right. First question that we have here. Oh, okay. This is a very important question. I do not live in Arizona. Can you still help me while I go through cancer treatment? Do you accept insurance? All right, that's a very important question. It says here, I've seen 7 doctors so far. Um, Nobody can tell me what. Okay, so that's another question. Let's start with the cancer question. So first of all, even if you don't live in Arizona, we do telemed appointments. But I will highlight because of the way my licensing is set up, I do have to see you at least once a year. But that being said, I do telemed appointments with patients from all over the country. That's a non-issue. Unfortunately, we're a cash pay. We cannot accept insurance because as a naturopath, I do not have that ability. So it would be cash pay. And then the other question that I have here is I've seen 7 doctors so far. Nobody can tell me what's wrong with me. My body, mind, everything is like it hurts. My mind is restless and it's hard to enjoy life when I'm chronically sick. What can I say to my doctors that will make them look at the root cause of my health issue? I live in Illinois and it's very different from living in Arizona. What is the process? Okay, that's a very, very good question. And I love that you asked that. So, what you'll find is, and I will put that right there, is I have created a guide that I hope you all download. And this guide is about knowing how to ask better questions and understanding whether your provider is a right fit for you. So with this guide, you'll find different cues, some of which I've kind of touched on today, but it really does help to know the right kind of questions to ask your provider. And that guide is absolutely free. You can download it right here and just scan your code, like it says here, or find the link in the chat. I'll make sure that I add that link to the chat. And feel free, if anyone wants to ask me questions, please, you can reach out. I will add my contact information at the end of this webinar. So you can shoot me an email. You can reach us through our website, newlegacynaturalmedicine.com, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. And I also have a podcast. It's called Decoding Disease with Dr. Rue, where currently we're actually talking about mitochondria, and we're actually going to much more detail than I have with this webinar. So if you have any other questions, hopefully that will help to answer those questions. If not, like I said, please feel free to reach out. And for those who came in late or for those who unfortunately missed that webinar, this webinar will also be on our YouTube channel. Just type in New Legacy Natural Medicine on YouTube and you'll find the replay not only to this webinar, but all our other webinars as well. All right. And then the other question that I have here is, what is the process to becoming a patient at your clinic? Love that you asked that question. So with that, first of all, I'm going to say I have a clarity session because I know, especially when you've been dealing with the chronic illness or cancer, A lot of patients that come to me have been jaded. They have been put through the ringer. They have seen numerous doctors, nurses, and not gotten the answers that they need. And it's heartbreaking and it's frustrating. So with that, I always encourage patients, if you're not sure, we start with a clarity session. And that clarity session is a 45-minute appointment where you and I just talk. I don't necessarily give you a treatment plan, but I guide, I listen to you and I tell you what I feel would help, give you recommendations on steps forward. And if you feel like we're a good fit and you're like, I like this, then we can then move on to a deep dive consult if you have chronic illness or to an oncology consult for those with cancer. And the payment for that clarity session gets subtracted from the payment that from the total payment that you would pay at that initial consult. But if you feel like, you know what, I don't even want to do the clarity, I want to dive right in, all you have to do is go to newlegacynaturalmedicine.com, fill in, there's a form, I think it's literally on every page. We tried to make it very easy. Fill in your information and we will contact you as soon as possible. We try our best to do that because we realize that, people deserve answers. And if you're reaching out, you want us to help and you're already a priority from the time you fill in that information. We'll reach out to you and we'll walk you through all the steps that you need. And for those who are curious, like I said, in terms of what I do, there's so many things that we do at New Legacy that range from nutrition, mind-body medicine, acupuncture, energy medicine, IVs, if supplementation, the list goes on. So there's so many different tools that we utilize depending on what you're going through. Everything is very much individualized and is based on what you're going through. All right. So, just to finish off again, I just again want to thank you so much for being here. Really, really appreciate it. And I also want to let you know that we're currently accepting new patients. So again, you can go on our website and find more information. And this is my contact information. I think the only thing that I did not put there is the podcast, and my apologies for that. But again, like I said, you should find the link on my Instagram. You can find it on our website, and the podcast is Decoding Disease with Dr. Ru. And again, if there's anyone else, let me just double check, make sure we have not left out any questions for anybody, because I realize, let us see here. All right. All right. There's no other questions. If you do come up with any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out and I'll be more than happy to answer them. Again, thank you so much for attending and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.